Hello everybody! Now that the dust of E3 2016 has settled down a bit, I will try to summarize everything interesting this E3 had to offer. My first topic would be the new Zelda with the title Breath of the Wild. I won't talk too much about it since I can't show you any footage because Nintendo of Japan would just claim my video. They don't like it when people talk about their games on the internet, so please don't tell them. Anyway, I have to admit the new Zelda impressed me, but I also liked their presentation of the game. They just sat down with a bunch of people from Nintendo and played the game for 5 hours. Maybe it's just me or I interpret too much into it, but just the presentation of the game was a statement by itself. Keep in mind that the game will be released sometime next year. Usually you just see a render trailer and after watching it you are as clueless as you were before, with the final game sometimes being very different from what they've shown there. But don't get me wrong here, this could still be the case with the new Zelda, but we got such a detailed impression of the game that it seems very unlikely, and I think Nintendo has confidence in the game and its gameplay. But let's talk about the game. One thing that was very impressive was the size of the world. It was gigantic. The atmosphere gave me some Shadow of the Colossus vibes. And even though they went for a very open world approach, I never felt that they lost their love for the detail. If you climb up a mountain and look into the distance, you see interesting places there. And everything you see, you can just go there. Or the climbing itself is tied to stamina, and if you run out, you fall down. So if you climb up a mountain, you have to find safe places to regenerate. That makes climbing higher mountains like solving little puzzles. But there's more to it. There are different temperatures, and if it gets too cold, you have to change your clothing. And if you climb up, it gets colder too. Another point I want to mention is the combat. It seems like it has a lot of options and details to it. For example, they showed enemies that had to pick up their weapons first, and if they weren't able to, they had to fight with their bare hands, so the combat changed. But let's move on to another topic. So much about not talking too much about Nintendo, but Zelda was actually one of the more interesting games of E3, so I think it deserved the time. Also, my prediction was wrong, but I had in mind that the new Zelda would be an exclusive game for the NX, but it will be also released for the Wii U. I have already covered the Microsoft press conference in my last video, so I will link it down in the description. I mainly talk about Project Scorpio, which was one of the most interesting things of E3 this year for me. So let's move on to the EA press conference. Interestingly, I haven't too much to say about this press conference because it stood under the slogan "More of the same." Let's start with Battlefield 1. I have to admit that I'm more interested in the game after seeing some more gameplay footage, even though the presentation wasn't that great. Also, I like the idea of a giant airship crashing down and changing the environment of the map. In that regard, I hope they can implement the destruction feature in a meaningful way again, like they did with Bad Company 2. But I have the bad feeling that there are only 1 or maybe 3 maps that work very well with the destruction feature and airships crashing down changing the environment, but the rest of the maps will be just okay-ish. But we will see. Moving on. Titanfall 2. They added a single-player campaign, which is not a bad idea. But in my opinion, the problem with Titanfall 1 was not the lack of a single-player campaign. It was a bad and boring multiplayer story campaign something that you had to play to unlock all the custom titans, and the lack of interesting game modes. The good news is they will add at least 1 new game mode, of course new titans and weapons, and if this works out, I think Titanfall 2 is looking good. My next point on the list is Mass Effect Andromeda. They have a new galaxy, new characters, and I hope they tune up the role-playing mechanics of the game again. Because I didn't like where the series went after the first Mass Effect, just from a mechanical standpoint. Also, let's hope that they won't repeat this DLC debacle from Mass Effect 3. The next thing on my list would be EA Originals, which is a funding program for indie developers. If you see it as a heavy curated version of Steam greenlight just with funding, then you probably can imagine that there will be interesting things coming out of this. They showed us a game called Fee that was funded by this program and it looked high quality, so I'm looking forward to the games coming out of this program. Let's move to my last point, which I called more Star Wars stuff, and it is related to my prediction video where I predicted that EA will probably do something with a Star Wars license. They haven't announced anything specific, just said, hey, we are working with different studios on different Star Wars games. So the most interesting side note out of this is that Amy Hennig, the writer of the Uncharted series, also working with Visceral on a Star Wars game, and this could be probably something we should keep an eye on. But let's move on to the next press conference, not chronologically, but on my list. And that would be the press conference of Bethesda. The first point on my list would be Dishonored 2. They showed us a lot of gameplay and we will dive deeper into the world of Dishonored, which I like. The art design, the aesthetics, even the atmosphere all look fantastic. They also promised more verticality, and I have to admit I'm interested. Next, that would be The Elder Scrolls Legends, a card game. I like to see some competition for Hearthstone, even though the game is very different from Hearthstone, but it competes in the same market from my perspective. It will be free to play, and also on the Microsoft press conference, as a side note, they announced Gwent, the Witcher 3 card game. It will also be free to play, so that are interesting times for people who like playing trading card games. The next thing on my list is actually big. It is a new Quake game and it is called Quake Champions, but yes, the title already implies that it goes into the direction of Overwatch and I'm a little bit worried here. It's kind of funny that Overwatch and friends borrowed a lot of old arena shooters and now the arena shooter is borrowing something back. But I'm a little bit skeptical here because they break up an old school arena shooter concept. The concept that you always start under the same conditions, at least when the game starts. And I'm not sure how this will work out, to be honest. Sure, in theory this will add strategical depth, but if you're not able to balance it properly, then you have a mess. And I don't know if this is what the arena shooter genre needs right now. The next point on my list would be Fallout 4 VR. While it's nice to see that a big title is pushing VR, I'm a little bit skeptical that they can actually deliver a very good VR experience with it, because Fallout 4 was never designed to be a VR game. And I don't know how motion sickness will affect the game, but we will see. The last 2 points are very short. First of all, they didn't announce a new Elder Scrolls game, which is exactly what I predicted. And second, they announced a new Prey game, but I haven't played the previous one, so I can't really comment on this one. But it looked interesting. Let's move on to the Ubisoft press conference. And I will probably haste a little bit through it because they showed us a lot of things we already know about, but also a few interesting things I want to focus on. The first point would be the new Ghost Recon, and to be honest, they showed us nothing new, just a trailer. But through this game I learned about the term of jingoism, I hope I pronounce it correctly. And when I understand this term correctly, Ghost Recon Wildlands is exactly that. In addition, although they haven't shown us any gameplay at all, it looks like a typical Ubisoft game. Next, I have to say I'm not the biggest South Park fan, but I have to admit that I was impressed by the last game and also impressed by the new game. It is like playing an actual episode, and this is, I think, what most people want out of a South Park game. The next thing on my list would be Star Trek Bridge Crew VR, which is probably the dream of every Star Trek nerd in the universe. But I have a few concerns about the game. It looks mechanically not that interesting, so I can imagine that it has this wow cool effect, and when it wears off it gets boring very fast. I could imagine that this could be a problem. Another problem is the setup. If you need 4 VR devices, this is quite expensive. Then they showed another VR game called Eagle Flight, and it could be fun. It's a game you play against other players, and I don't know why you need VR for it. Then we have Watch Dogs 2, and I have to say it looks like more of the same. So if you liked Watch Dogs 1, you will most likely like Watch Dogs 2 too. That was a strange sentence. Next we have Trials of the Blood Dragon, which is an interesting idea, but I've never played a Trials game, so I can't really comment on that. Then I want to mention Grow Up, which is a sequel to Grow Home, and most likely a very good game. But now comes the first really interesting game for me, For Honor. Ubisoft revealed that it will have a single player campaign, and from my perspective that are very interesting news. Originally I thought it would be a multiplayer only title, and now they expand the content of the game with a single player campaign that uses the fighting mechanics of the multiplayer. I see how this can work. And especially if they manage to create a compelling and interesting single player campaign without compromising the multiplayer aspect of the game, I think this could be a great game. But let's move on. Besides an Assassin's Creed movie and maybe a Watch Dogs movie, they have announced their new IP. And this is actually a surprise. It is called Steep, and it is a game about wingsuits, paragliding and skiing. I would call it an extreme sport game with focus on sharing your stunts, doing races, or just enjoying the landscape while paragliding. It's not my kind of game, but if the controls are good, I can imagine that some people will actually enjoy this game. I think the surprise is that it seems a little bit niche, but still looked very expensive. And I have to admit, I really like that they just showed gameplay, and I think you could also play it at E3. It's always a good sign if a company just shows gameplay and not a bland trailer that tells us pretty much nothing. From my perspective, this expresses confidence that the game is actually fun to play. But let's move on to the last press conference, the press conference of Sony. And this is hard to cover because Sony just announced game after game after game without even speaking in between. It was actually impressive. The first point on my list is also the first point in the press conference, God of War. They actually announced a new God of War and showed us some footage. It seems like that Kratos now lives in a Nordic world and has a son, and is stalked by a cloaked dude in the background. And he has a beard now, but we didn't see how deep the gameplay actually is. If I think back to the old God of War games, we had a lot of combos and special attacks, and you could power up your weapons and attacks. You had also a lot of QTE events, but they usually looked very impressive and awesome. I think they recreated those QTE moments very well in the video, but still the combat hasn't convinced me, to be honest. The reason for this is that previous God of War games were very combo focused and you could upgrade your abilities and weapons, while the presentation of the new God of War game focused more on a cinematic experience. The older God of War games had that too, but in combination with very good gameplay. And it could be still in the game and they just haven't showed us, but for now I'm at least a little bit skeptical. The next interesting game of the Sony press conference for me was Death Stranding. That is a new Kojima game, and as this channel name implies, I'm also a Metal Gear Solid fan. So I'm interested, and what happened was they showed us a very cryptic trailer of Kojima's new game. My interpretation would be that the handcuffs are a symbol for Kojima now being free, and that the baby that suddenly disappears is the Metal Gear series that he now lost, or his previous work with Konami that is still part of himself but was taken from him. Of course that would mean that the man is Kojima himself and all the footprints on him are the games he had worked on and that had left marks on him. The 5 men standing in the air looking upon on him could stand for the 5 big Metal Gear games he made and that he will always be remembered for. And the big ocean and the dead whales could symbolize Konami, once a big ocean of creativity and quality themselves, full of life with big titles like Contra, Castlevania, Turtles in Time, Snatcher, Suikoden, Silent Hill and many more. When I was a kid, I could trust a game from Konami to be good. Now, they are dead, only producing pachinko machines. Still, endless potential, but no life in it, at least when it comes to gaming. I have to admit I feel pretty confident about this interpretation. But we still have no clue what the game is about, but I think the game will be pretty interesting in one way or another, if you keep in mind that we now have an unleashed Kojima making it. Next on my list would be Resident Evil VII. I haven't played it and I haven't seen too much of it, but it has a new style and I think that is exactly what the series needs right now. Also, it's a VR game, but also playable without VR. The next point would be The Last Guardian. Not only they showed us new gameplay footage, but they also announced the release date, which is the 25th of October 2016. It will be released very soon and the running gag comes to an end. I don't know why, but my prediction is that this game will be actually good. Maybe not as good as Shadow of the Colossus, but at least decent and people will like it. They showed always gameplay footage and it seems like that Sony and the makers of the game were very confident in it, so I believe in them. The next game on my list would be Horizon Zero Dawn. It seems like they are going more into the direction of an RPG than I thought, and this made me less skeptical, to be honest. So they have dialogue options or resistances and weaknesses, fire damage, different damage types. This actually surprised me, I have to admit. The next game on my list would be Detroit Become Human. It's a David Cage game, the guy who made Heavy Rain or Fahrenheit, and I like the setting, but I don't like David Cage games, so I'm a little bit skeptical. Funnily enough, I first thought of Cyberpunk 2077 when I saw the setting, but then I realized the choice options and thought, wait, this is a David Cage game, right? And I was right. I assume that if you don't like David Cage games, this game won't make you like David Cage games, so whatever. But let's move on. The next point on my list is Sony is pushing VR. So they announced a lot of VR games. Farpoint, a new Batman game, Resident Evil VII, Star Wars Battlefront, X-Wing VR missions, Final Fantasy 15 will also have some sort of VR feature nobody understood. Sony is really going for it, and this is a good thing for VR because the only way to make VR successful is you need games for VR. Then another point would be the new Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. They showed a trailer and I have to admit that this was probably the most interesting trailer for a COD game I have seen in years. Maybe it's just a space setting, I'm a huge space nerd, so that helps a lot. But I really liked it, even though maybe just 1 or 3 missions are like this and the rest is your typical COD game, but who knows. Then the next point would be Sony announced an exclusive PlayStation 4 Spider-Man game, and this could work out for them very well, but I have no clue. Then I only want to mention that there will be a new Crash Bandicoot remaster, which a lot of people will like, I guess, and there's also a new Lego Star Wars game to Episode 7. I don't like Episode 7, so I won't talk about it. And the last game on my list is Days Gone. It's a zombie game and maybe Sony's spin to Microsoft's Dead Rising or the new announced State of Decay, which was also a surprise. But I have to admit that the zombie horde really looked impressive. But maybe that's not enough, because all we saw was some little story and a guy shooting hundreds of zombies. And there are a lot of very good zombie games still out there. And I don't know, I'm a little bit skeptical, to be honest. And this ends my video. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Maybe consider subscribing if you're looking for more content like this, or just follow me on Twitter. Thank you for watching and goodbye.